Thank you so much, and it's really great to be at the Center for Fiction. I should say back at the Center for Fiction, because I taught here a year and a half ago, and it's just a wonderful place. So we're going to each start by reading for just a few minutes, and then we will ask each other impertinent questions about our books. So I'm just starting at the beginning of the Children's Crusade. Bill Blair received his discharge from the Navy on a September morning in 1954. He'd served on hospital ships off Incheon and Pusan, Korea for 2 years, and then completed his service at the Oak Knoll Naval Hospital, a cluster of wooden barracks on a grassy hillside in Oakland, California. On the afternoon of his discharge, he borrowed a convertible and headed across the Bay Bridge, an unplanned adventure that seemed like just the ticket for a fellow with some time on his hands. The sky was the same lovely shade of blue as the hyacinths in the bridal bouquet at his sister's wedding 4 months earlier. He'd gotten a weekend's leave and made it home to Michigan in time for a pre-wedding family breakfast, at which his years of service were so celebrated that the very thing he'd sought from the trip, a return to the life he'd known before open wounds and gangrenous limbs and amputations, slipped finally and irrevocably out of his grasp. Outside the church, he stood with his parents in his dress blues and felt as lonely as he ever had in his life. He'd first seen San Francisco from the deck of the USS Haven under a sky choked with clouds. Now, as he drove, he found himself drawn less to the bright downtown than to the low-lying hills beyond it, beribboned with candy-colored houses. He stayed on the highway, heading for the next set of hills, and soon he was moving alongside the pale bay, approaching the airport. Seagulls swooped out of the sky, tiny icons of the aircraft landing on the glittering tarmac. This was the first convertible he'd ever driven, and despite all his time at sea, he'd never had quite such a confrontation with the wind. His face was pummeled, his hair blown flatter than the bunk of an enlisted man. Up ahead of him, on the prow of the car, the noble, brave Pontiac bore down on the unknown with an attitude of calm determination. Leaving the bay shore, Bill meandered for a mile or two until he found the King's Highway, or so it would be called if the name were rendered in English. This he knew from the bits of Spanish he'd picked up in Oakland. El Camino Real. This King's Highway boasted car lots and supermarkets. Nothing to fill Bill's heart, but every so often a vista opened and included the sudden rise of yet more hills, some thickly forested, others the color of hay bales in autumn. He pointed the chrome Indian westward and drove through neighborhoods of brand new houses that seemed like decoys for something marvelous he would discover soon. Twisting past a golf course, he entered a grove of pines. Narrow roads split off and disappeared around curves and up hills. On an impulse, he followed one of these, winding among low-hanging branches with leaves like tiny silver spears. When he slowed down, a smell of earth and bark came to him, and overlaying that, something pleasantly medicinal, the inside of a pharmacy staffed by wood creatures. The road leveled off, and a path beckoned him to leave the car and make his way to a clearing where a magnificent oak tree stood guard. He was the grandson of a farmer on his mother's side and a doctor on his father's, both third-generation Michiganders. As a boy, he'd expected a life like that of his father, the doctor's son, who'd gone to work at a local bank and was now president and chairman of the board, a man who dressed in a suit and tie every day and had the house painted biannually because it was important to keep up appearances. Bill's mother was an exemplary housekeeper, using vinegar to make the windows sparkle and bleach to keep the bed sheets bright on the line. Known locally as the gal whose one visit to Chicago had left her half blind after a small rock kicked up by a streetcar struck her in the eye. She had a glass eyeball with a blue iris 2 or 3 shades lighter than her true eye color, an asymmetry that made her shy with strangers and unassailable to her children. Bill had grown up believing virtue was a ticket to contentment, but the war had exploded that notion, and he needed something to replace it. The oak was the most splendid tree he'd ever seen, its gnarled branches snaking every which way. He would learn later that it was a California live oak, species Quercus agrifolia, or sharp-leaved oak, and the ground beneath it was carpeted with curled, brittle leaves and peculiar elongated acorns. An idea had been forming during his last months of service that his skills and training could be adapted toward a type of medicine that might, over time, supplant his memories of men blown open with bodies that wouldn't be subjected to such violence, the bodies of children. He would have to do a second residency in pediatrics, but he did not mind the idea of deferring his work life for a few more years. A period of preparation more or less equal to the number of months he'd given the Navy might in some way cancel that experience and return him to the confidence and optimism he'd felt on the day he received his sheepskin from the University of Michigan Medical School, the best he could hope for now that his family had mistaken him for a hero. He surveyed the land in front of him and slipped into a reverie in which he was surrounded by children, dozens of them, darting between trees, throwing balls, jumping in leaf piles, calling "Ollie, Ollie, oxen free," more children than he could father himself, but not nearly as many as he could help. I'll stop right there.
That was lovely. I'm going to read from the beginning as well. There was a time, and it was many years ago now, when I had to stay in a hospital for almost 9 weeks. This was in New York City, and at night a view of the Chrysler Building with its geometric brilliance of lights was directly visible from my bed. During the day, the building's beauty receded, and gradually it became simply one more large structure against a blue sky, and all the city's buildings seemed remote, silent, far away. It was May, and then June, and I remember how I would stand and look out the window at the sidewalk below and watch the young women, my age, in their spring clothes out on their lunch breaks. I could see their heads moving in conversation, their blouses rippling in the breeze. I thought how when I got out of the hospital I would never again walk down the sidewalk without giving thanks for being one of those people. And for many years I did that. I would remember the view from the hospital window and be glad for the sidewalk I was walking on. To begin with, it was a simple story. I had gone into the hospital to have my appendix out. After 2 days they gave me food, but I could not keep it down. And then a fever arrived. No one could isolate any bacteria or figure out what had gone wrong. No one ever did. I took fluids through one IV and antibiotics came through another. They were attached to a metal pole on wobbly wheels that I pushed around with me, but I got tired easily. During the beginning of July, whatever problem had taken hold of me went away. But until then, I was in a very strange state, a literally feverish waiting, and I really agonized. I had a husband and 2 small daughters at home. I missed my girls terribly, and I worried about them so much I was afraid it was making me sicker. When my doctor, to whom I felt a deep attachment, he was a jolly-faced Jewish man who wore such a gentle sadness on his shoulders, whose grandparents and 3 aunts, I heard him tell a nurse, had been killed in the camps, and who had a wife and 4 grown children here in New York City. This lovely man, I think, felt sorry for me and saw to it that my girls, they were 5 and 6, could visit me if they had no illnesses. They were brought into my room by a family friend, and I saw how their little faces were dirty and so was their hair, and I pushed my IV apparatus into the shower with them, but they cried out, "Mommy, you're so skinny." They were really frightened. They sat with me on the bed while I dried their hair with a towel, and then they drew pictures, but with apprehension, meaning that they did not interrupt themselves every minute by saying, "Mommy, Mommy, do you like this? Mommy, look at the dress of my fairy princess." They said very little. The younger one especially seemed unable to speak, and when I put my arms around her, I saw her lower lip thrust out and her chin tremble. She was a tiny thing, trying so hard to be brave. When they left, I did not look out the window to watch them walk away with my friend who had brought them and who had no children of her own.
So now we're going to have a conversation. Do you want to start?
Yeah. So what gave impulse to this book? You know, like why did you write this book?
So Usually the seed of a novel is pretty identifiable. With the case, with the Children's Crusade, it came about very slowly and from a few different seeds. I should say that after the beginning I read, this man, Bill Blair, does become a pediatrician, and he finds a woman named Penny and marries her, and they have 4 children. And the 4 children, the novel is sort of divided into 2 styles. In one, you get sort of important points in the family's history, moving forward from the 70s to the late 80s. And then in the other style, which is interwoven, the 4 adult children take turns telling the story of what's to become of the family home with the parents gone. And I really started out by thinking, I was imagining an older sister and a younger brother. And the 4 children are 3 brothers and 1 sister. But I was really thinking only of a sister and a brother. And the brother coming home to the sister in some kind of trouble, which actually happens in this book. But the characters I was imagining are not the characters in this book. They were a different older sister and a younger brother. The trouble was similar, but I had other names for them. I wrote 50 pages about them with, different voices and different points of view, and the thing just was dead in the water, and I abandoned it and wrote a different book. And then after I had finished that different book, one hates to waste anything, so I went back and looked at the pages again, and I started to think about the fact that I had done a lot of my fiction had a brother and sister pair, and I'm the sister to one brother. And I thought maybe it would grip me better if I introduced other children to this family. And I added 2 more brothers. And indeed, that helped a lot.
And they're so different. They're all so different. It's just
the 4 children are they're very different.
Distinct.
Yeah. Another seed for this book is that when I was growing up, I grew up in Stanford, California, which is basically Palo Alto. It's very tidy. It's a nice little suburb. Over the hill from us was Portola Valley, which is where this book is actually set. And it's just the opposite. It's very rustic, rolling hills, the old oak trees like the one I described in the opening. And I had a sense from visiting family friends there when I was a kid that the people who lived there had very free lives compared to the life that I lived as a kid. And especially the children. I had this image, and I don't even know if this is true or something I made up, of these kids that we would visit just running wild on their property. And I pictured them running around barefoot. Mm-hmm. And then I thought of that as a setting for these 4 children who I was beginning to imagine. But one can never get away from one's true nature, and so I began to worry about what kind of tetanus shots they might need if they were running around barefoot. And so
the doctor,
they got a pediatrician for a
They did indeed.
So,
exactly. That's funny.
And then I guess the third seed is a friend asked me well before I started with those precursor characters. He said at some point, what's your first principle? And I was very intrigued and somewhat baffled by the question. And what do you mean? The idea that you would live by. And, after I got over the embarrassment of not having an idea that I would live by, I came up with one. And I sort of said, well, I just really, really believe that people should be really careful about children and how children are treated, and children's feelings in particular, their well-being, and they really ought to just be very careful about that. And we parted, and I sort of thought, that is my first principle, actually.
Yeah.
And so that kind of is the rallying cry of the book, in a sense, and that furnished a big
Children should be careful.
piece of it. Yeah.
Right.
So
That's, let me just ask you, because you mentioned that you had these 4 sections of adult children speaking to the reader, and interspersed among the very, the movements of the family and all that would be these chapters of and in first person, and it was just so well done and so intriguing to me. So when did you decide, where were you in the process of writing that you made that decision to do that? Because I thought that was really a brave decision and interesting.
Well, thank you. It was kind of making a virtue of necessity, in that when I first was trying to imagine these 4 characters, these 4 adult children into being, I wrote 10 pages in one voice, and I wasn't sure, and I wrote 10 pages in another voice. And I wasn't sure how I would use them, or if I would use them. And in fact, I set aside those early first person attempts to get voices for the children, and I started writing in the third person the material about the father getting out of the Navy and finding the land. And I just had this idea, and I think again it's a matter of not wanting to lose pages that you've worked on that have some merit. I didn't want to lose those early attempts to figure the characters out, and it was really it was kind of a light bulb moment that I could interweave them and do that.
Nice.
It's the kind of, I think, big design ideas for a novel often come very quickly and all at once. I find it difficult to imagine coming slowly to an idea about structure. I don't know what led you to write this book, and were there false starts or?
I have no idea.
Really?
What led me to write this book? I really didn't. It took me by surprise. I wasn't expecting to write this book at all. I was working on other things. I was at the point we were talking about upstairs, where I just work on a whole bunch of different things every day and different scenes, and just make a huge mess. And that's how I work. And I had a couple of scenes of a mother and a daughter in a hospital, but I wasn't really that interested in them. And then, but I didn't shove them off the desk, because I do very easily throw things on the floor. So it kept coming around, and then I began to realize, and so it just sort of unfolded. I mean, it was her voice. I think it was Lucy's voice that I realized, I need to listen to this voice. But I didn't plan on writing that book.
And from the beginning, the hospital room was key. It
apparently
started in the
those
hospital
were the
room,
scenes,
and
that I had originally written.
And so obviously it was always in the first person, and
I tried it in the third person. I don't like to write in the first person. So I tried not to, but it's the first. It's her voice. The story is her voice. So I had to come to terms with that. I think that was it.
And I'm trying to remember with your previous work, has it mostly been third person narrative?
Yeah, it's always been third person.
Always?
Yeah.
So, wow.
Except for a prologue and the Burgess voice.
Oh, that's
People
very
forget
interesting.
about that, I think, in the books. Yeah.
So, interesting.
Yeah. So do you, it sounds like you don't write from beginning to end. Is there a point where you finally say, okay, this has now become it's got to have a beginning, middle, and end, or do you? How do you do that?
This was the first time that I wrote it all out of order.
I've
always had to go exactly in order.
Interesting. Okay.
And never been a writer who, it sounds like you do, would maybe just write scenes not knowing where they would fit in, or I've always been very, very much a straight line kind of writer. So that was new. And once I had arrived at this idea for a structure, of going back and forth between the past and then these 4 separate voices narrating the present, I did start doing it in order. And I wrote this section about Bill getting out of the Navy, and then the first section that has all the children in it. And then I start with the oldest of the 4 children, telling the beginning of their present day story, and then go back into the past again. There is a point here, which is that when I got to the next of the adult narrators, I couldn't write it. And so I ended up doing all of the past sections before writing any more of the adult children narrating the present. But that actually made sense, since the events of those earlier passages had to have happened before. Yeah. Yeah. There's a wonderful moment in your book where the narrator, who is at the time of the events of the book an emerging writer, has an encounter with an established writer who says to her something along the lines, and I'm going to quote it incorrectly, I'm sure, but everyone has one story. You've got one story. People are going to tell you that's not enough or whatever, but it is. Do you feel that there's any truth to that for you as a writer?
You know, I thought about that when I wrote the line. I thought about it a little bit. I didn't think about it too much. But, yes and no. And I'm not trying to be, a wimp about this. I don't think I am. But I do think that there is some essential story that everybody has that will pretty much be on the page in one way or another. But one can push the parameters very far, so that I guess there's the connective tissue between all the work of a writer, and yet I don't know that I would actually say what she said, which is that we all have one story, and you'll, what did she say? You'll write that story in many ways, but you'll have one story.
Yeah.
So
maybe it's more a matter of having one sensibility.
That's what she said. Yeah, right. So, because you brought up your what was it, the principle, your first
principle, yeah.
Right. So I'm just curious, because I thought it was so interesting what you think of the mother Penny, and what. Toward the very beginning of the book, I thought there's this one sentence, and I thought that's so smart because you just flipped it right on its head, where she's thinking about her husband and she loves him very much and everything, and she said, but there was just one thing she didn't not like about him, but whatever it was, which is that she never knew what he was thinking. And I thought, oh, that's so fabulous, because I could tell that would be obviously going to be a problem. And so, and I felt for her at that moment. And I felt for her all along. I felt for all of them. But I just wondered, so how did you think of Penny? Given that children require care.
Yes, and she's not great at giving it,
No.
I should tell you. She's a very difficult character. I don't mean difficult to write, but she's a difficult character for the other characters. She's a poor mother, and could easily be described as a selfish monster, although I didn't want to leave it at that. So for me, in writing this character of this woman who really probably shouldn't have had any children, certainly shouldn't have had 4, and certainly as the 4th shouldn't have had the wild child youngest.
But that happens.
Right.
In life all the time. A lot of people.
And she doesn't react to it very gracefully, right? So,
yeah, and that happens too. It's
right.
real.
Absolutely. So, as I was working on the book, on the first draft of the book, I was actually very judgmental toward Penny, and I was sort of laughing at myself for writing what I felt was kind of unfair fiction about this character. And I sort of had another first principle, maybe a writer's first principle of getting at the essence of each character and not making some of them satiric and others realistic.
Right.
But I thought there was some reason why I was doing it that way. I didn't know what it was, but I just made a conscious decision to just let it rip, basically.
Right, and you do explain, I mean, you know, it's all there, why, you know, her mother not wanting her to play with the crayons or put the crayons, whatever, you know, put the crayons away. The whole idea of being artistic was always sneered at for her.
Right,
you know,
right.
And she felt
and so
that she had
she's
to do.
in adult life wanting to be an artist. But what happened over the course of, you know, many drafts of the book is that I did start sort of sanding the corners and trying to go more deeply into her. And one of the things that early readers said was that Bill, the father, was too much of a saint, and Penny, the mother, was too much of a monster. And it's funny, with every book, there's something that you're doing with each revision. You're trying to do it, and it was bringing Bill down a little and Penny up a little. That was sort of my project over the course of, you know, 4 drafts or whatever.
Right.
And by the end, I realized that one of the things that had kept me from being fair to her, going deeply into her when I was first writing the book, is that I was afraid the book would then be too sad. And by the end, I was happy for it to be sad, but that had been sort of what was preventing me from.
Well, it's interesting because I actually saw the father's kindness, and he was unbelievably kind to his children. But I began to see it from Penny's point of view, and I thought this puts her in a double bind because she can never be as nice as this man is. He's just absolutely lovely every minute to these children, and it was just interesting how, because I loved him as well. How could you not? And yet, I thought, oh, imagine being married to that, though. You know, so it was interesting.
Well, the reaction to Penny has been very divided.
Yeah.
And I think it's most often people who are artists themselves or comfortable with having conflicted feelings who are able to tolerate her, and other readers have been very, very uncomfortable. And I wonder if with Olive Kittredge, in which there was a very difficult character, did you encounter a really divided reaction among readers?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. There are people that love her, and there are people that hate her, and they tell me.
Yes. I had one person say about Penny, she's not a mother, as if that were a...
Well, she is.
Exactly.
She's
that's
exactly
the
the mother, and that's the whole story.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and whatever.
I one thing I really loved about Lucy Barton was the way that one got a sense of Lucy not quite remembering or struggling to remember these events that are 20 years in the past or something like that. And I started thinking about the way, in some way, it feels like a memoir. It feels like a memoir as fiction.
Right.
Partly because of the struggling with maybe the nature of memory, the limits of memory. And how conscious were you as you were writing of those themes and wanting to explore them?
Well, I was aware that, I mean, when I finally settled down and said to myself, okay, you're going to have to write this, let's do this now, I was aware that I was writing what I thought of as a faux memoir, you know, because it's not my story, but it was Lucy's story, and it was going to be written in the form sort of a memoir. And so I was aware of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And when there's some things that she withholds until late, which felt to me like she was warming up
Yeah.
to disclose some of the more painful
Right.
parts of the story.
Right.
Did anything go into the decision to do it that way, or?
You know, I think when I realized I told you I didn't want to do the first person, and I think I didn't want to do first person because I was afraid a first person can get sometimes, and I was afraid of this, can get so much in the head of the reader. It's just like it just makes you feel like you're rattling around inside somebody's head. And I didn't want that, and I don't do first person enough to know how to. But when I realized, wait a minute, there's a retrospective here.
Mm-hmm.
She's, and that's when I settled down and I thought, okay, she's looking back, and that's a distance that will help the reader not feel like, oh, I'm in Lucy's head all the time, so that it would be like a storytelling of somebody from a vantage point of looking back, and that was sort of how I got on the bicycle, so to speak,
Yeah.
to begin to ride it. I think, yeah.
And it's very much set in New York in the 80s.
Yeah.
That's when this illness takes place, and her mother comes, and it's a very, very important visit from an estranged mother and daughter.
Yeah.
Had you written much about New York before this book?
Yeah, in the Burgess Boys, the book before, New York plays a pretty big role, I think. But it was a very, very different kind of book. I mean, Lucy comes from a very poor background. That's the point of her story, is that she was that kind of family that you find in rural areas who's so poor, they're just so poor that they're ostracized by everybody, and that was Lucy's story. And so for her to end up in New York City, for her mother to even come to New York City, was an astonishing. Her mother's never been on a plane before. So that travel, across class lines was interesting to me.
It's very interesting, and it's something that we don't see that much of, I think, in contemporary fiction, is really taking on class so directly.
Yeah, I'm interested in class.
Yeah, it's
So.
really compelling. Are we supposed to take some questions, or?
Take some questions? Okay.
So,
Questions?
anybody have questions? Yes.
I'm wondering what each of you, I have two actually. What are you each working on right now, and what are you both reading? Or are you working on anything?
I'm working on a new novel, just in very early stages, sort of feeling my way toward a story, trying to think about, it's funny, you don't really think when you're writing. I don't really think when I'm writing. Trying to build the characters on the page and figure out who they are and what their stories are. So it's still very early. Usually a first draft takes me 2 or 3 years, and I've been working on this for less than a year. So
I would love to tell you what I'm writing, but I just can't. Because I just can't. It's not good for the work, is what I've discovered. But I am a blabbermouth, and I would love to. So I won't. I'm reading a number of different things, but I've been reading the last part of the biography of Elvis Presley, the second book of Gorelnik's biography of Elvis Presley. It's just so interesting. It's just, I didn't know anything about Elvis Presley, and now I do. And it's a very sad story.
what prompted you to read that book?
I think I was prompted because in Lucy Barton, the mother speaks of Elvis. And so I thought, well, let's find out who Elvis is. And boy, have I.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah. So.
Other questions?
So knowing now what you do about Elvis, would you change what you said about the mother's admiration for him?
No,
So you inadvertently
I
got
did.
it.
I mean, I did. Right. I knew enough about Elvis to understand that what she was saying, but then I thought, oh, let's really find out about him. Yeah. No, but I stick by it. No, she's. yeah.
Yes.
I'll ask a dual question as well. It's an anxiety of influence question. But I'll tell you where it comes from is a moment ago you said, or both of you actually had talked about poor background and how it's difficult to render that. And it put me in mind of Russell Banks, in especially something like Trailer Park, and your Olive Kittredge structure kind of suggests that to me as well. Who do you admire, each of you, living or dead, or would like to be seen as be proud to be emulating that person?
Do you want to go?
Sure. Yeah. I think the most important living writer for me is Alice Munro, and it's so incredibly satisfying not to have to explain who that is anymore.
Yeah.
It's funny, emulation, it doesn't quite get at the relationship I have to work I love. I think I was recently rereading Children of Light by Robert Stone, and that got me thinking about some of his short stories. For example, he wrote a short story called Helping. Do you remember that story?
Yeah.
It's just a stunning story.
Yeah.
And I was thinking what I love about his work and what I love about Helping in particular is the intense emotion that it evokes. And there's something about Alice Munro's work in which she is so carefully focused on delving into the feelings of her characters, and the feelings that are in response to not necessarily huge events. I think what I would say is that those approaches or concerns resonate really deeply for me.
I would say Alice Munro as well, as being a huge influence on me growing up. I mean, she just has been just somebody who really was very important to me. And William Trevor as well. I don't know if you know the work of William Trevor, but I love William Trevor. I just love him. And I just always go back to his stories. He's so comforting, and he's just wonderful, and so, I don't know, I just love him. And so Alice Munro and William Trevor were always sort of these two guiding lights in my writing life in a certain way. But I also, I love Scott Fitzgerald. I just love that. I love Tenders. I love The Great Gatsby, but I love Tenders the Night. I think it's beautiful, and I may be the only woman left who loves Hemingway, but I do. I love him, and so those, whatever, and Updike and Roth and all those people, Cheever. I've really been affected by them.
Yeah.
Hi, my question is actually for both of you. I know that you guys said that you kind of, Strout, that you kind of scrap together stories and then it makes a bigger picture. But your characters are always so fully realized. Do you draw any inspiration from people you know? Both of you. Like their situations or?
Yes and no. I mean, it's a very valid question, and I just, it's hard for me to get what's in my mind to you in an answer about that. It's like, it's sort of like a dream where you've seen somebody in an orange bathing suit and then you dream about an orange bathing suit, but it's not that person in the orange bathing suit. It's all these different people that have come my way, that are all kind of a compilation of something that becomes absolutely unique on the page as I write. And I'm perfectly aware that there is always the seed of myself in any character, male or female, that I'm writing, because I'm the only person that I know, if I even know that much. You know what I'm saying? So I have to admit that there's always something that has to do with me. But I have always been a watcher. I've always watched people. I love people. I find them so interesting. So I've all my life watched people and just stared at them and made stuff up about it.
Eavesdropping.
Yeah, God, I love it.
I ditto. Everything she said is really true. I don't ever take someone in life and put them in a book, but there are always little elements, and not necessarily, you don't necessarily see it coming. I mean, I can remember writing my first novel. I was writing about a very minor character, and I suddenly realized that I was putting little aspects of my mother-in-law in the book. Oh no! I hope she doesn't recognize herself.
She may or she may not.
Right.
What
right.
can you do?
Right. Exactly. That's another thing that Sarah Payne says to Lucy.
As Joyce Carol
Don't be protecting anybody.
As Joyce Carol said, what did she say? She said, if you don't want to be written about, don't know a writer.
Yeah. Definitely.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was really finished. Right here?
Both of you, but I think with Olive you said, or maybe I'm wrong, that you began the book, you first wrote the last chapter first, or you had written the last chapter.
Yeah, I didn't. Here's the story about the last page. It's the last page of the last chapter. I wrote the last page.
Last page.
Not first, but in the middle of all the mess that I was making about Olive. I saw that. I just saw her in that scene, and I wrote the last page, or the last 2 paragraphs, or whatever it was. I just wrote it almost word for word, and I stuck it away. And I actually wrote "end" on the, and I didn't lose it, thank God, because I'm very messy, and I really am. And then, as I began to collect the book, and I realized, oh, wait, here's the story with River and Jack, and wait, where's the end? And I found it, and it was actually the end. It was very strange.
How does that compare with Lucy? Did you begin at the beginning?
I sort of began, I began at the beginning a little bit in terms of the mother-daughter scenes, but then I didn't. I don't write from beginning to end, and so I didn't write from beginning to end with Lucy either. But it wasn't ever as startling as that last page of Olive, which still startles me. Yeah.
The same question?
Could you actually reword it
Oh,
or repeat
yeah,
it? I guess it would be the word.
Did you begin at the beginning?
Oh, okay.
Or did you write any endings or way down, at almost near the end first, and then from that use that to feed the rest of the story?
I wrote mostly from front to back, from beginning to end. As I said earlier, I ended up saving the first person voices of the adult children and writing that after I'd written all of the passages that were about the entire family through periods when the children were children. But I've never sort of written or known an ending exactly. I've had a sense of where something would land emotionally, but not exactly how I would get there or how it would read.
I'm wondering about if you feel that your gender informs your work, and if so, how?
It has to. I mean, I think it has to because I'm a woman. So, but how it does, I don't actually spend a lot of time thinking about it, but it does, and I know that. Somebody asked me one time, don't you have? They didn't put it very nicely. Something like, don't you have trouble writing about men? And I said, no, not that I'm aware of. and I don't. Not that I'm aware of. I mean, it's not any more difficult for me to, go inside a male point of view than it is a female point of view. And so, in that sense, I guess, I don't think I'm inhibited. But the point is that being a woman obviously has to affect what I work and how I work, and I'm not unaware of the problems of being a woman writer. I'm not unaware of them at all, but I'm not interested in them.
Yes, to be very simple about it. I think that it's as fundamental as the fact that being a woman informs who I am as a person. And I think I would echo what Liz said about not really being that interested in it certainly as a problem. I mean, I think being a Californian informs me and informs my writing. Being my parents' child, there are just certain elemental truths about our experience that by necessity will inform our work. Anybody else? Yes?
I was really struck by the character of Olive, and I'm curious. I mean, she's does so many incredibly sort of self-unaware things.
Yeah. She
But
does.
but there's something incredibly likable and knowable about her. I'm just curious, how did you develop the character?
I don't honestly really know, and she came to me pretty fully formed, actually. There's a lot of characters that I have to scratch around for quite a while to find. But the first story I wrote was where she steals her daughter-in-law's bra at her son's wedding. And that story, when I wrote that story, I realized, here's a person I'm going to write about. And I had lots of stories that weren't really working, and they were just waiting for Olive. Just stick her in there, boy, all of a sudden you'll have So, I don't know. I mean, I understand what I think you're saying, and I really don't know. I do remember one night telling myself she'd done something particularly awful that day, and during my work day, and I remember thinking, this isn't good. And then I remember making the very conscious decision, no, let her go. Let her be Olive. Let her be Olive. Let her be Olive. Whoever that is. So, yeah.
Maybe we have time for just one or two more questions.
One or two more? You had your hand up, sir. No? No, maybe not. Anyone? Yeah?
So I'm just curious, if you go back to your first novels that you wrote and yourself as a writer then, and talk to yourself now as accomplished, published writers, what would you tell yourself as a younger writer in those first early stages of writing as advice?
Good question.
I think if I were to try to address my writer self writing my first novel, which was not my first book. I had published a collection of stories before that, but I got very, very hung up writing the first novel. It took 10 years. It should not have taken that long. I would urge myself to hurry up. And I don't mean that quite as coldly as it sounds, but to try to do more from draft to draft. I was making the tiniest incremental steps forward from one draft to the next, and I think I would urge myself to have a little more confidence.
Well, to tell myself to have more confidence would be ludicrous.
Well, there's that.
Because I can't tell myself that. I wish I could, but that wouldn't happen. But I would actually, the truth is, I would say to myself, Strout, you just keep writing going just the way you did. Because it took me a very long time to learn how to write my sentences. And there was no rushing it. And I understood that at the time. I understood it, that they just weren't good enough. Mm-hmm. And I just kept trying and trying and trying and trying. And my first novel took me 7 years to write, but I was learning to write the whole time. I mean, for all the years before that, I was just learning to write. I was teaching myself how to write, and I think it comes more easily to some people, and it didn't come that easily to me for a number of reasons, but I did teach myself to do it, and that's not a bad thing.
Why didn't it come easy to you?
I don't know. I just don't know. I think I had the perceptions of a writer, because I could observe and I could tell, and I knew. I mean, I knew what a writer needs to know in terms of knowing things about people or intuiting things, but I could not find the sentences to translate that for the long. I kept trying, and I don't know.
Yes, maybe this is the last one.
I was afraid to ask this because according to my Kindle, I've only read 20% of your book so far. And maybe this is answered in a lot of part. I had a great deal of trouble getting a reason why for the marriage between Bill and Penny. You gave us, up to that point, very, very little. I couldn't find out why they got together.
I think that they're wondering that throughout the book.
Okay.
I think that I don't want to explain, I don't want to tell you what my explanation would be, because you're the reader right now, and the sense you make of it or the nonsense you make of it is what needs to be for your reading. That said, I think of it as being a lot about a combination of loneliness and timing, and not necessarily anything about the personalities of the two people.
I think the timing part was very apt. Mm-hmm. I mean, particularly given the time.
The time and the timing.
Yeah,
right.
The time and the timing. It's what happens. All over the place.
The 50s have anything to do with it? Because I can't quite imagine that happening now.
That's what I think what we mean by the time, that time period. It was, there weren't that many choices. Yeah.
I'm sorry to talk about your book.
No.
Well, see, here's the story.
This is what she really meant. So I guess we have to stop now, but thanks everyone.
Yeah, thanks.